Good afternoon or good morning, depending where you are. Thank you for joining this webinar, which is an initiative of the RECEIPT Horizon 2020 Research and Innovation Project. RECEIPT stands for Remote Climate Effects and the Impact on European Sustainability Policy and Trade. And it's one of the two innovation actions that are looking into the remote climate risk. That means how impact or manifestation of climate change that occur elsewhere might impact European resilience and stability. My name is Jaroslav Mysiak. I'm from Mediterranean Center on Climate Change, and this is the institution that is hosting this webinar. And today we have two distinguished speakers. First is Thow, who is the coordinator of the INFORM initiative. INFORM is the primary source of risk crisis risk and severity analysis in multilateral system. It is a partnership of UN organizations, civil society donors, and technical organizations that came together to develop and share assessment of that is useful for crisis prevention, preparedness, and response. So Andrew is also from the information branch of the UN Office for the coordination of humanitarian affairs. As the INFORM coordinator, he built a partnership of over 30 organizations and established INFORM as a well-regarded and reliable producer of analysis, which is now used by decision makers across the humanitarian, disaster risk reduction and development sectors. The second distinguished speaker is Dr. Sepehr Marzi, who is the postdoctoral researcher at the Mediterranean Center on Climate Change. He holds a PhD in Science and Management of Climate Change from Ca' Foscari University of Venice, and Master in Environmental and Geomatic Engineering from Technical University of Milan, also in Italy. His research is mainly focusing on the topics that relate to the role and development of composite indices and indicators of climate change and sustainable development policies and practices. So those are distinguished panelists, and without any further ado, I would invite Andrew to take the floor and introduce the INFORM concept and partnership. Over to you.
Thanks, Yaro. Hello, everyone. Just give me 1 second to organize myself here. Okay, hopefully this is working. Great. So yes, as Yaro said, I'm Andrew Thow. I'm from the UN Office for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, which, for those of you who may not be familiar with the UN system, it's the part of the UN Secretariat which is responsible for the overall coordination of crisis response. And this also extends as well to preparedness activities and so on. So I just want to talk to you a little bit today about the history of INFORM, what it does, and introduce the partnership, essentially. So it's, as Yaro said, a multi-stakeholder forum for developing shared and quantitative analysis that's relevant to humanitarian crises and disasters. Was started in 2013 by the Interagency Steering Committee, which is a body for coordinating humanitarian organizations within the UN and also the UN partners, as well as the European Commission. So INFORM includes organizations from across this multilateral system, as well as donors and technical organizations. It's the Joint Research Center of the European Commission, which is the technical lead for INFORM. And as Yaro said, OCHA, my organization, is acting as the coordinator. And really, the main purpose of INFORM is to provide a shared analysis of crises and crisis risk. The idea being that everybody in the response or preparedness system should be operating with the same information. So really what we're trying to do is establish this shared evidence base, and what that really involves is jointly or co-designing methodologies and products that can be used in the decision-making processes of partners. So there's two main elements to that. So one is this shared or co-design process, and the second part is to improve decisions. That's really what we're trying to do. So a lot of what we do through Inform is we're trying to aggregate, filter, summarize lots of data and information in a way that makes it usable for decision makers. One of the main reasons why we would want to do that, and certainly one of the main reasons why OCHA is so heavily involved in Inform, is having this shared evidence base is a form of coordination. So it's kind of a soft coordination in that, you know, we don't, we're not telling partners what they should do with this information, but by having a common evidence base that we can all use, it's a way of making sure that we're more aligned around risk and some other elements which I'll go into. There are some principles which we use in Inform to guide the work that we do. So one of them is global. We're covering all of the countries in the world with these products. That's very important, especially for organizations which work in some countries with a less well-developed infrastructure for collecting information. So we make sure those are all included. And the second principle is that all of the information that we use and the results of Inform are open. So they're open source, and you can see exactly how they're produced. Thirdly is reliability. There's two elements to that. So one is obviously working to produce the best possible data, best possible scientific results that we can. And then the second part on the reliability is being able to depend on those products being there in the future. And so we can invest in our decision-making processes. And that's something which the donors of Inform have committed to. And then lastly, I would say what's very important about these products is that they're flexible. So the idea is that they can easily be included into a decision-making process of any organization, essentially. So there's essentially a suite of products which support decision-making around crises, and they're kind of based around what you're probably familiar with as being a disaster management cycle. So firstly is the Inform risk index. So this is something which measures generalized risk of there being a crisis in a country which would overwhelm national capacity. The use of that would more be for crisis prevention, disaster risk reduction, preparedness, and so on. At the other end of the timescale is an Inform severity index. So this is focused more on applications around response or early action. And what it does is measure the severity of an existing crisis. So between these two, you have a generalized risk and then an impact in the severity index, which is a crisis which has already happened. And then lastly, we're working on a product which kind of falls in between, called Inform Warning. And the idea of this is to try and monitor how those risks are changing dynamically and how they may become a crisis. So it's kind of a way of aggregating this early warning information to support sort of early action, preparedness, anticipatory type of decisions. And that's something which we've just started this year, a scoping phase for. So let me talk very briefly about the Inform Risk Index. I'm sure Sepehr will go into some more detail. This is the first product which was developed by Inform. It's been published now for several years, and we publish it twice a year. It's quite well embedded in the decision-making process of various UN organizations, donors, and so on. And essentially what it is a composite indicator which measures the risk of a crisis or disaster that would require international assistance. And the time frame we generally say is sort of a 3 to 5 year. So this is the risk of a crisis in the next 3 to 5 years. And it includes elements around hazard and exposure, vulnerability, and coping capacity. The way these indexes work is that there's the results are essentially a number between 0 and 10 for the overall index and for all of these components which you see here. And that's one of the ways that makes it useful for decision making. In terms of how these products are used, I'll focus more on the risk index because that's really what we're most concerned with here. So this, as I said, is more focused on longer term planning, resource allocation, and so on. The main uses or main ways that you can use it, let's say, are to kind of prioritize countries by risk or by different components of risk. So for example, hazard associated with earthquake or vulnerability associated with food insecurity, for example. The second way is as a kind of risk profile for a country. So by looking at these results, you can see which components of risk are most important for each country. So it gives you a kind of a profile which you could perhaps use to think about how you could reduce risks. And then the last use is as a way to monitor these trends. So it's not a very dynamic index. A lot of the components are quite structural, so it does change quite slowly over time. But you can use these risks, the index to monitor trends. I mean, a little bit more specifically, there's some examples here for you to look at on how certain organizations and donors are using it. One big kind of use case is around resource allocation or pre-allocation of funding for crisis response and as well as preparedness. And this is something which is done with ECHO, for example, uses it in their annual aid strategy as a component of that. I mean, it's important to probably say this is only one component of these decision-making systems. There's lots of other information that goes in there. Likewise, there's kind of more operational agencies are using it. So the World Food Programme, for example, has a corporate alert system of which this is a component. OCHA, as you may or may not know, manages a UN fund for emergency response, and Inform is used to support decision making around one of the funding windows in that response fund. And then probably the last application which I could mention is that this methodology for risk analysis can also be applied what we call subnationally. So with more subnational levels of detail, and that's something which has been done in quite a few countries and regions. And one example is in the Sahel region, where we've built a separate risk model for that region, which has subnational level detail, and that has been used for the to support the UN integrated Sahel strategy. So I mean, that's just a very quick look at how it works and how it's used. Just in terms of the adaptation, which we'll discuss now on climate change. Many informed partners are very excited about this as an initiative, and that's probably, I would say, for two main reasons. So firstly, these types of decision-making tools are becoming more and more of an important way that we work. And I think that's related to the need to make better use of data and evidence. Until now, it's been very difficult to incorporate a lot of the complexities of climate change into a decision-making tool like Inform. So we're very excited to see the work that's being done to do that. And then secondly, the climate change timeframe is not something which we're currently covering with the Inform products. And there's many partners and other users as well who are looking further ahead than we currently are. And they want to see how climate change will impact risk in that longer time frame. And that's obviously very important for informing adaptation decisions. So it's obviously very timely as well with COP26 coming up. I think it will be very beneficial to have this work out there. It's really going to help the UN, I know for sure, and I'm sure many other organizations to try and synthesize information about some of these climate change impacts. Obviously, it's not going to be the only tool that we can use, but it will be a very useful addition. So we're very supportive of the work that is being presented here, and I will leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andrew, for this excellent overview of the Inform Risk Index family. Now, I would invite one or two burning questions from the audience. To do so, simply type the question in the question and answer facility of the Zoom or post it in the chat. If there is no question, I would have one, Andrew, if you allow. I was just thinking, you know, the indices related to Inform family are excellent and well thought and well elaborated and designed in order to fulfill a range of purposes. I was just wondering whether there is any plan or whether you think it might be useful in the future to capture also what has been done by the countries or regions in order to reduce the disaster risk. Something like, you know, extending the Inform risk also into the reporting or capturing the past efforts to reduce the risk. Do you see any possibility to do that?
Yeah, I mean, to a certain extent, we are doing this already in the lack of coping capacity part of the risk index. Unfortunately, that has traditionally been one of the areas where it's quite difficult to get good information. We're hoping, and we have done some testing now with the new Sendai framework monitoring, and also the SDG monitoring. As they'll start to come online and we get more information, there should be better coverage of a lot of those, as you put it, efforts to reduce risk, and that's something which hopefully will be captured in the risk index better, let's say, over the next years.
Excellent. Thank you very much. In the meantime, the audience, please don't hesitate to post the questions. And at this stage, I would invite Sepehr to take the floor and introduce the climate extension of the Inform Risk Index, which has been done in collaboration with the Inform Consortium and Joint Research Center as a part of the RECEIPT project. And Andrew, thank you very much for all these excellent collaboration between Inform Risk Consortium and CMCC, and for the opportunity to do this analysis. Sepehr, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Let me share my screen.
Yeah, it works.
It works. Okay. Thank you very much, Jaro and Andrew, and thank you everyone for joining this webinar. This is Sepehr Marzi from Humanitarian Center on Climate Change. As part of the work package 5 from receipts, in order to identify remote hotspots affected by climate change for the countries involved in EU External Action Partnership, we collaborated with Inform Consortium and JRC to include climate change projections into prestigious Inform Risk Index. So as Andrew explained, Inform is a global disaster risk management index designed for humanitarian risk. It includes hazard and exposure, vulnerability, and lack of coping capacity dimensions. And the scores are standardized between 0 and 10 for each component. The natural hazard and exposure component of Inform includes climate-related hazards such as floods, storm surge, and drought. In our exploratory study, we are going to look into how climate change amplified hazards and development pathways may change the country's performance with respect to Inform Risk Index. To do so, we add projections to inform indicators where it's possible and or explore ways to replacing existing indicators with the ones can be projected. We consider the time horizon up to 2050s, means 2036 to 2065. We expect 3 main outcomes from this study. We explore the change in risk performance due to changes in hazards, only hazards, then the changes in risk performance due to changes in both hazard and exposure, and finally we investigate to what extent the increase in coping capacity and reduction in vulnerability would be needed to compensate for the increase in hazard and exposure. Here's the schematic presentation of 3 stages of our analysis. As I said, in the first stage, we calculate the risk only using the projections of hazard. In this case, the population is fixed at 2015 values using global human settlement layer from JRC. In the second stage, we use both projections of hazard and exposure using shared socioeconomic pathways. These 2 levels of analysis gives us the ability to compare the trade-offs between changes in hazard and exposure and population. In the third stage of analysis, we fix the risk at the current levels, then import the projections and calculate the differences between vulnerabilities that are required to keep the current risk levels. So current Inform Risk Index 2020 for floods, it uses Global Assessment Report 2015 Annual Expected Population. We replace this with the simulations of river floods from JRC lease flood using RCP 8.5 projections. For the storm surge component of Inform, again, it's based on GAR 2015 Annual Expected Exposed Population. We replace this with the simulations of coastal floods from JRC lease coast under RCP 8.5. For droughts, Inform uses 2 indicators: probability of drought using the agricultural stress index from FAO and the population affected from EMDAT. Unfortunately, the probability of droughts from ASI are based on remote sense data for vegetation health, and it cannot be projected in the future. So we thoroughly replaced the drought component with population exposed to drought based on standard precipitation evapotranspiration index based on RCP 8.5. For the population scenarios, based on literature review on the combinations of SSPs and RCPs, and also based on the opinion of expert panels on received, we use SSP3 scenario, regional rivalry. It's based on low investments in human capital, low income growth, high fertility and population growth in high fertility countries, and low fertility rates and population growth in currently low fertility countries, low migration and slow urbanization. As you can see in the figure, most of the changes with respect to the baseline happens in Africa, Western Asia, and South America. So for the river floods, as I said, we use the expected annual population exposed using the GLOFAS tool from JRC, 1 kilometer grid resolution hazard maps for RCP 8.5 and SSP3. Ensemble, which is derived based on an ensemble of 7 high-resolution CMIC 5 GCMs. On the right side, you can see the changes between the baseline and projections for constant population and SSP3. So at global scale, 126 million people are projected to expose with the current population and 175 million people under SSP3. The largest absolute exposure will happen in Asia, and the largest changes in South America. For the coastal floods, we used probabilistic coastal flood simulations for different return periods for RCP 8.5, which is derived from 6 GCM ensemble models and global DFlow FM setup. The results show again the largest absolute exposure is in Asia. At global scale, 64 million people will be affected considering the current population, and 72 million under SSP3. The largest changes found in Africa and South America under SSP3. For the droughts, we use 12-month SPEI, Standard Precipitation Evapotranspiration Index, derived from 21 CMIC 5 AOGCM models. We consider the severe and extreme droughts with SPEI below -1.5. The results show that at global scale, 1.1 billion people will be exposed under current population and 1.5 billion under SSP3. The largest absolute exposure in Asia and the largest changes in Oceania and Africa. These values for 3 hazards are standardized standardized between 0 and 10 and imported into the INFORM framework to calculate the risk. Here is the results for risk. On the left, you can see the INFORM climate change baseline, which is based on the baseline values of the projections. And on the right, you can see the absolute changes in 2050s under constant population, and here under SSP3 population. So we found that the that we found in trade-offs between population change and amplified hazard. The amplified hazard has a major role in increasing the risk in the future rather than population. This can be used, this finding can be used in policy makings for mitigation and adaptation in the future. Then the third stage of the analysis, as I said, we kept the risk constant at baseline levels. We changed hazard and exposure and calculated the vulnerability and lack of coping capacity to keep the current risk. The results reveal that most of the countries and regions need to invest in reducing vulnerability and increasing coping capacity to compensate for the increasing climate amplified hazards. Countries in Africa, South America, Western and Central Asia and Eastern Europe tend to show high reduction classes to keep the current risk. Most of these countries are identified with low to high initial risk classes, not very low and not very high. For the countries with very low initial risk, they are more resilient and they're able and they have the resources to maintain their very low risk. On the other hand, for the countries with very high initial risk levels and informed framework, that the risk is already at its highest levels, so the change in hazard and exposure component doesn't show that much change in informed risk. So the low vulnerability and lack of coping capacity reduction can translate it into different prevention and preparedness policies for different socioeconomic characteristics of the countries. Then in the last stage of the analysis, to explore the distinct contribution of vulnerability and coping capacity dimensions, we estimate the change in hazards, a change in these two dimensions due to amplified hazards, while the risk is kept at initial values, at the current values, for the countries that are characterized with high reduction classes in the figure. These results can help us to identify how and where we need to more invest and prioritize the humanitarian resources in vulnerability or lack of coping capacity. Three different patterns can be identified among these countries. First, the countries like Turkmenistan with medium vulnerability and high lack of coping capacity. So in this case, we understand that we have to invest more in lack of coping capacity. In the case of Turkmenistan, it's mainly driven by low institutional capacity due to high corruption perception and weak government effectiveness. Then in countries like Jordan, with high vulnerability and medium lack of coping capacity, in this case, we have to focus more on vulnerability. In the case of Jordan, it's mainly driven by a high number of uprooted people because of the Syrian refugees crisis. And then the last type of countries like Senegal with both high vulnerability and high lack of coping capacity, which is mainly driven by deprivation and low accessibility to health systems in these countries, mainly in Africa. In a contributing paper to Global Assessment Report 2022, the following organizations, and they're all informed partners, they expressed their interest in our tool and wrote how they're going to use the tool in the context of horizon scanning and global humanitarian risk monitoring. For example, the United Nations Development Cooperation Office, UNDCO, is going to use the tool to assess the economic transformation analysis in CCA. For International Organizations for Migration, IOM, the tool can help them, that may contribute to develop a stronger analytical capacity that can link to their current data collection capacities. The IFRC, International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, already uses informed impact data to inform DRR and climate change adaptation interventions, ensuring these efforts are based on sound science. And finally, the FCDO, United Kingdom's Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, and its partners may use this tool to assess future likely humanitarian needs and invest in appropriate preparedness measures. This work is still on progress. Now we are in another paper, we are trying to include the dynamics of vulnerability and lack of coping capacity using the projections based on shared socioeconomic pathways. And the pilot study will be presented at COP26. Thank you very much. Going back to Jaro.
Thank you very much, Sepehr. That was really good, and thank you for keeping the time and allowing for a discussion. I mean, your presentation made clear the extent of work, but what I particularly like is the user feedback on this work, how the different organization might use this. This is absolutely valuable. Excellent. So we have a couple of questions. I would start perhaps with one question from Gabriele Standardi, who asked whether you could imagine a different combination of RCPs, the representative climate pathways, and SSPs, the socioeconomic shared pathways. For example, would it be possible perhaps to combine RCP 8.5 with both the SSP3 and SSP5?
Thank you very much. Yeah, yes, sure. And we already have done for SSP5 as well, and it's presented in a paper under review now. But also for different RCPs, for the work now on progress for the COP26, we may also include RCP 4.5. It's mainly driven by data availability, and whenever we have the data, we will also include other RCPs and SSPs.
Fantastic. There is another question in the chat from Artur Nessenfelder, who says it is indeed very valuable to exchange the previously used data for coastal risk with the data set that you have presented. Previously, it was only the storm surge. Now, now you are considering the the extreme sea levels, which is probably better expressing the coastal flood risk across globe. But his question is different, and the question is: so far, the index cover the time frame up to 2050 in the RCP 8.5, and the question is whether we should not look also into other climate projections and other timeframes. For example, whether it might be interesting to look into the time frame up to 2030, 35 to offer a more immediate outlook for the policy and decision makers in humanitarian aid. So not only what happens in 30 years, but what we can reasonably expect to happen in the next 10, 15 or 20 years. So what do you think?
Sure. Actually, JRC and the partners are also interested in shorter time horizon to be able to actually use this information to monitor SDGs and Sendai targets. And it will be useful for that. We are working on that. And but the RECEIPT project, the time horizon was set to 2050s. And beyond that, the informed partners and JRC are not, at that time, they were not interested. Now there's an increasing interest in beyond 2050. But yes, we can include also a shorter time horizon to be able to, it will be more useful for SDGs and Sendai targets monitoring.
Fantastic. Then I would like to ask a question, and it's probably impossible not to touch upon the disaster that we have just witnessed happening in Germany, Belgium, and Netherlands and Czech Republic. And I quickly make the comparison with the past records, and it seems that this disaster is going to make it 5th in the list of deadliest floods in Europe since 1960 or something. Now, if I remember correctly, in your slide, you have shown the sharp increase of the population exposed to riverine floods in Europe. Is it correct? So, what is your interpretation?
Yes, exactly. There is an increase, huge increase in river flood. Let me share the slide again.
So while you are looking for the slide, my question was going to be, do you think that the European countries that have rather a good performance in reducing the fatalities from climate extremes, shouldn't they look into similar composite indices for humanitarian aid or climate risk projections in order to better prepare for similar events that we have just witnessed over the past few days or weeks? Yep, it's over there. Yes, if you could increase, right.
Yes. Actually, also in our study shows that with all the resources in Europe available now, still the amplified hazard is that much that European countries like Germany should still need medium vulnerability reduction to keep the current risk. So it shows the level of increase in hazard and exposure. And as we found in this study, the risk is mainly driven by hazard and exposure rather than population changes. So mitigation should be the core. Mitigation and adaptation should be the core focus now, and especially in Europe. So they need to invest a lot, because Europe, especially in floods and droughts in the southern part of Europe, they need to, that they will face increased hazard in 2050.
Yeah. And if I may, I would ask a question also to Andrew about the conceptual design of the informed risk and the possibility to perhaps include other impacts. So far, the informed risk is using as the key impact measure is the affected population. And I know that in this group of, among our participants, there are economists that are used to assess the entity of the damage caused by the extreme climate, but also impact on the economy at large, impact on GDP, the employment, and so on. So, Andrew, I was just wondering, do you plan to continuously look into also other type of indicators that would express the impact of unfolding disasters, including climate change or the amplifying effect of climate change on those extreme events? Would it make sense for you to include, for example, impact on GDP in addition to the impact on the population affected?
Yeah, I mean, it would make sense. I think, I mean, certainly with the origin of the risk index was more around, you know, the impacts of humanitarian crises. So in a way, it's a little less well adapted to the more developed countries where, you know, the majority of the economic losses relating to natural hazards take place. I think, you know, now this work shows that it's possible to make the adaptations to the index. I could foresee perhaps we might, for the purposes of a climate change index, we could perhaps think about you know, reconfiguring the entry point. So perhaps it's more of a combination of economic losses, human losses, and so on. I think that perhaps would make more sense as well, given the time frame, that, you know, those economic losses will be important for all countries. So would make sense perhaps to have that as a starting point as well. So I think maybe that would be a good next step once we have this adaptation, is to then kind of look. It's obviously shows quite promising results. Perhaps there's a better way to configure the index to show those in a more meaningful way, and then I think that might be one change we could think about making.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. I don't see any further questions. I'll leave it for a few seconds. If somebody would like to intervene, you might also raise the hand, and we can unmute your microphone if you would like to ask your question directly. If not, I would like to thank Andrew and Sepehr for this very interesting insight, very interesting piece of work. Congratulations for the you know, very important work that you are doing at the global level, and also, you know, together with European institutions and UN agencies and other major stakeholders. So this is really an excellent example of work where the research community can really engage in working with the practitioners in humanitarian aid to develop something that is useful for the practical operation. So thank you very much both, and thank you to all participants to this webinar. I should have said that at the beginning. The webinar has been recorded and will be available from our YouTube channel and also from our project. We will organize similar webinars about other aspects of the research in the RECEIPT project, and where we look basically into how climate change, together with other other pressures might undermine the development efforts in several countries across the globe, including the Horn of Africa. And we are looking into trade disruption, the multiple basket failures, flood and extreme climate event, and the impact on different connections that might eventually create some significant impact on European resilience or European stability, and also the resilience and stability of European strategic partners. So we will keep you informed till the registration will be available. Thank you also to CMCC organizer Elena and everybody else who helped to prepare this webinar, and have a nice day. Thank you. Bye-bye.